They're not carrying the show. What do you mean? What do you mean they're not carrying the show? We don't understand.
There's a phrase that gets thrown around a lot in Hollywood: on-screen chemistry. Producers talk about it like it's something you can engineer in a casting room, like you just line up the right faces and let the cameras roll. But anyone who has watched enough television knows the truth. Real chemistry cannot be manufactured. It either exists or it doesn't. And when it exists at the level that Leah Remini and Kevin James found it, the impact doesn't just shape a show. It shapes an entire life. Leah Remini has said it plainly more than once, and she means every word of it. Kevin James ruined her. Not in a bitter way. Not as a complaint. She says it the way someone talks about a meal so perfect they can never order the same dish anywhere else again. He set a standard for trust, for loyalty, for what a real working partnership feels like that she simply has not found replicated anywhere in the decade since. And when you dig into the full story of how these two people found each other, built something extraordinary together, and kept that bond alive long after the cameras stopped rolling, you begin to understand that this isn't really a story about a sitcom at all. By 1997, Leah Remini had every reason to believe her moment had passed. She had anchored a sitcom called Fired Up on NBC, put in the work, shown up every day, and watched the network cancel it after a single season. In Hollywood, that kind of failure tends to stick. It follows you into rooms. It makes executives hesitant. It makes agents vague. And it makes you start wondering whether the whole thing was a mistake to begin with. So when her agent called about a new CBS comedy, a blue-collar queen's family show built around a stand-up comedian she had barely heard of, Remini wasn't exactly walking in with confidence. She was walking in with honesty, which, as it turned out, was exactly the right move. Kevin James had already been attached to the project. He was the reason the show existed at all, and he was very deliberate about who was going to be cast opposite him. This wasn't vanity. James understood something that a lot of actors never fully grasp. A comedy about a married couple lives or dies entirely on the believability of that marriage. You can write the funniest lines in the world, but if the two people delivering them don't actually feel like they've shared a refrigerator for 10 years, the audience will feel the gap. He needed someone who wasn't going to perform a wife. He needed someone who was going to react like one. When Remini walked in and started reading with him, something immediately clicked. She didn't wait politely for her turn to speak. She interrupted. She pushed back. When he went off script with an ad-lib, she didn't panic. She fired something back that was sharper than what he'd said. It wasn't a performance. It was a conversation, the kind that has an edge to it because both people are actually paying attention. The executives in the room that day were evaluating actresses. James was evaluating a partner, and he found one. What makes that audition even more significant is what happened after it. When network hesitation surfaced, because it always surfaces, especially around someone with a recent cancellation on their resume, James didn't stay quiet. He made his position clear. Leah Remini, or he walks. That is not a small thing. That is a person putting his own position on the line for someone he had just met, based entirely on instinct and a 15-minute read-through. Remini has spoken about that moment as the one where she understood, even before a single episode was filmed, that this man operated differently. He wasn't just picking a co-star. He was choosing someone to back. The King of Queens went into production in 1998. It would run for 9 seasons and 219 episodes. But the number that matters most isn't in the ratings. It's the fact that the friendship formed during those years is still intact today. Ask most actors about their ideal working environment, and they'll describe something calm, collaborative, professional, a place where everyone respects each other's process and nobody raises their voice. That is not what Leah Remini and Kevin James built on the set of The King of Queens, and it is precisely why their chemistry worked. They argued constantly about lines, about timing, about who owned which joke, about how a scene should be played. These weren't quiet disagreements handled in hushed tones after the director called cut. They were loud, immediate, and utterly unfiltered. If Remini thought a line wasn't landing right, she said so. If James felt she was playing a beat incorrectly, he told her. Neither one of them believed that keeping the peace was worth sacrificing the work. What sounds exhausting in description was, in practice, liberating. And here is why. When you argue constantly with someone about small things and resolve it and do the scene anyway, and then laugh about it 5 minutes later, you build something that politeness can never build. You build the certainty that this person will be honest with you. You stop wasting energy wondering what they're actually thinking. You stop managing their feelings. You stop performing professionalism. You just work, and you trust that if something is wrong, they will say so. That trust created a very specific kind of freedom on set. Remini has described how the physical scenes between them, the moments of closeness that sitcoms require, carried a charge precisely because they had just spent 20 minutes in conflict. There was no performed tenderness. There was no manufactured warmth. There was two people who were genuinely comfortable enough with each other to drop every guard, which is the closest thing to real intimacy that a camera can capture. James was also, by every account, an exceptionally generous scene partner. He shared the joke. He didn't need to be the funniest person in every exchange. When Remini's line was funnier than his, he let it be funnier. He played the straight beat. He held the pause. He gave her the moment. In a business built on ego and visibility, that kind of generosity is genuinely rare. It's the kind of thing you remember for the rest of your career, because it is so infrequent. He also taught her things. Remini has been open about the fact that sitcom timing was not her native language when she joined the show. James had spent years doing stand-up, understanding the mechanics of a laugh, when the audience needs a breath, when you can push through, when silence is funnier than the punchline. He shared that knowledge patiently across hundreds of episodes, refining her instincts and giving her tools she carried into every project afterward. And then he went further. He taught her about the business side of the work, how to understand your value, how to fight for your storylines, how to ensure your character isn't just a supporting pillar for someone else's arc. That education had real consequences. After The King of Queens ended, Remini negotiated from a position of knowledge and confidence that she had built in direct partnership with him. She wasn't the same actress who had walked into that audition feeling like a long shot. She knew her worth because someone had taken the time to show it to her. The boundary between their professional relationship and their personal one had blurred so completely by the middle of the show's run that it had essentially stopped existing. James attended Remini's wedding to Angelo Pagan in 2003, not as a colleague, not as a gesture of industry courtesy, as a genuine presence, someone who was considered family, and everyone in that room knew it. This wasn't a surprise development. The two had actually met before the show existed, crossing paths at a Cuban restaurant in 1996. The friendship predated the characters. So in some ways, Carrie and Doug were always just a fictional extension of something that already existed in real life. Two people who genuinely liked each other and happened to get paid to prove it on camera. What deepened the connection further was that it expanded outward. James's wife, Stefiana de la Cruz, became close with Remini. Their families intersected. Their lives overlapped in the way that real friendships do, not through formal events and professional appearances, but through ordinary time spent together, shared secrets, inside jokes, and the kind of presence that doesn't require a reason. One of those shared secrets, when Stefiana was pregnant during the later seasons, the production quietly worked around it, hiding the pregnancy behind kitchen counters and props while the cast and crew protected the personal information. Remini was part of that protective circle. It was another layer of the trust that had been accumulating since that audition, not just between the two leads, but between their entire orbits. The friendship was also a place where Remini could be honest about things she couldn't discuss publicly. Years before she left the Church of Scientology and years before she began speaking out about her experiences, she talked to James. He couldn't fully understand everything she was describing. He hadn't lived it. But he listened without judgment, without an agenda, without trying to fix it or redirect it. He just held the space. For someone navigating the particular pressures of being inside a powerful organization while privately questioning everything about it, having one person who would simply receive what you were saying without complicating it was not a small thing. It was, in many ways, everything. There is a dimension of Remini and James's story that rarely gets the attention it deserves, and it runs directly underneath the surface of all those warm memories about set fights and wedding invitations. During the years The King of Queens was in production, Remini was a member of the Church of Scientology. She had been involved since childhood, and the church, recognizing that Kevin James was one of the most popular television stars in America, had a clear interest in his potential recruitment. Remini stood in the way of that. She has described the pressure she was under from officials and elders within the organization to bring James into contact with high-ranking members, to introduce him at events, to serve as the bridge between her professional world and her religious one. She refused. Consistently. Strategically. She fabricated scheduling conflicts, created distractions, and managed the logistics of his life in ways he wasn't even fully aware of at the time. She protected him from an organization that she was still, at that point, publicly aligned with, which meant she was taking on a risk that existed entirely in silence. Think about what that requires. She was essentially fighting a battle on two fronts simultaneously, showing up every day to do one of the most demanding jobs in television, and quietly ensuring that the person she trusted most on that set never got pulled into a world that she was already privately questioning. She couldn't explain the full danger, because doing so would have required her to admit doubts she wasn't yet ready to voice. So she just handled it alone for years. When the full story eventually became part of her public narrative, after she left the church and began speaking openly about her experiences, it reframed the entire history of their friendship. The warmth and the loyalty that felt like simple affection between two people who happened to work well together was actually something more complicated and more costly. It was a friendship worth protecting at significant personal risk. And she did protect it. That decision, made quietly over many years on a sitcom set in Queens, preserved something that has lasted decades. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. The show ended in 2007, and by every measure it was still working. The final season was drawing over 7 million viewers per episode. The chemistry had not worn thin. The audience hadn't moved on. The ending was driven by James's desire to expand into film, a career move that made sense for him individually even, as it meant the closing of something that had defined nearly a decade of Remini's professional life. She has been honest about how that landing felt. It wasn't just the end of a job. It was the end of a daily structure that had become inseparable from her sense of professional home. Every morning, she had known exactly where she was going and exactly who she was going to see. She had known that whatever the day brought, she could argue about it with someone who was going to argue back and still have her back completely. When that disappeared, the absence was felt as something closer to grief than to career transition. The test of any bond is what it looks like when the structure that produced it is gone. In their case, the answer was simple. It looked exactly the same. They stayed in contact. They checked in. The friendship didn't require the set to sustain itself, because it had never really been about the set. When James brought Remini back to television in 2017 for Kevin Can Wait, the reunion was less a professional calculation than a confirmation. She stepped in when the show needed energy. Their scenes together instantly reignited the dynamic that fans had spent a decade missing, and viewership climbed noticeably within the first episodes of her appearance. The chemistry had not aged. It had simply been waiting. Remini described the experience of filming together again as immediate. No warm-up period, no awkward recalibration. They picked up mid-sentence, the way you do with someone who has known you long enough that the gap in time becomes irrelevant. That quality, the ability to resume as though nothing interrupted, is one of the more reliable measures of a genuine friendship. Performed relationships require maintenance. Real ones just continue. When Leah Remini says Kevin James ruined her for life, she is not speaking loosely. She is making a precise claim about what she learned from that partnership and why nothing subsequent has measured up. The standard he set was not about charm or talent, though he is both. It was about how he treated the work they shared, as something that belonged to both of them equally, worth fighting for and protecting and constantly improving. It was about the fact that he stood up in a casting room and staked his own position on her before she had proven a thing. It was about the years of honest conflict that never, not once, crossed into cruelty or indifference. It was about showing up at her wedding, listening to her doubts without judgment, and quietly becoming part of the fabric of her life in a way that didn't need an audience. It was about being the kind of partner who makes you better at your job and safer in your life at the same time. That is an extraordinarily rare combination. Most professional relationships offer one or the other occasionally. The fact that Remini found both for 9 years in the same person at a point in her career when she thought her chances had already run out. That is the story. She is not saying she never found another talented co-star. She is saying she never found another person who built a home with her out of the work. And that specific thing, that sense of professional safety, of being genuinely seen and backed, of belonging to a partnership rather than just appearing in a project, has been the measure against which everything else has been quietly evaluated. The 2023 photograph that circulated of the two of them, relaxed and close and looking like nothing had changed since 1998, wasn't a nostalgia piece. It was evidence. Evidence that whatever they built in those 9 seasons was never really about the show at all. It was about two people who found each other at exactly the right moment, chose each other consistently over the years,